I was a priest, and I carried a secret that could destroy my life. Every night, after the church doors were locked and the last candle was extinguished, I stayed behind alone. Not to pray the prayers people expected of me, but to open a hidden drawer beneath the altar. Inside it was a book no one imagined a priest would ever touch, let alone read in silence, trembling. It was not the Bible, it was written in Arabic. I did not read it out of rebellion. I read it because something in those words unsettled me in a way nothing else ever had. They spoke of justice without favoritism, of mercy without conditions, of a God who does not belong to institutions but judges hearts. I told myself it was only curiosity, a harmless intellectual exercise. But deep down, I knew the truth. The book was questioning everything I had become. I did not know that one night someone was watching. I did not know that this secret would turn into a death sentence. And I did not know that when the moment came, when my life would hang between the sky and a dark river, I would not call upon the God of my sermons. I would call upon Allah. My name was Jose, and for 15 years I served as a priest in a poor neighborhood on the edge of the city. By day, I was everything people expected me to be. I wore the cassock, delivered sermons with firm conviction, listened to confessions, baptized children, and spoke endlessly about discipline, obedience, and moral order. People respected me, but that respect was mixed with fear. I believed authority required distance, and distance required hardness. What no one knew was that when night fell, the man they saw during the day disappeared. After the last parishioner left and the iron doors of the church were locked, I remained behind. I would turn off the lights, walk past the silent pews, and enter a small room behind the altar. There, hidden inside an old wooden drawer, was a book wrapped in plain cloth. I took it out only when I was sure no one could see me. It was the Quran. I did not arrive at it suddenly. It began with fragments, quotes I heard, debates I read, questions I could no longer silence. Then one day, I found a translated copy and later an Arabic one. The language frightened me at first, but it also drew me in. The verses spoke of justice with a clarity that left no room for excuses. They spoke of mercy as a responsibility, not a favor. And they spoke of a God who sees what lies behind titles and robes. I had never declared faith in Islam. I did not even allow myself to imagine it openly. Fear controlled me. Fear of the church, fear of society, fear of losing everything I had built. So I lived in contradiction. By day, I preached strictness. By night, I read words that quietly dismantled my cruelty. Every page felt like a mirror. I saw the faces of people I had rejected. The hungry young man I sent away because of his appearance, the crying mother whose imprisoned son I dismissed as a sinner deserving his fate. Each verse about compassion pressed against my chest like a weight. The more I read, the clearer it became that my rigidity was not righteousness. It was arrogance disguised as faith. Outside the church walls, the neighborhood was suffering. Corrupt police officers ruled through fear. Families were extorted, young men disappeared, and silence was enforced through threats. I heard these stories in whispers and confessions. Slowly, something changed in me. The words I read at night gave me the courage to speak during the day. I began condemning injustice from the pulpit, not knowing that my voice had reached the wrong ears, and not knowing that my secret, my quiet reading, my hidden struggle had already been seen. I was living two lives, one in the light and one in the shadows, and I did not yet understand that this balance was about to collapse violently and forever. The neighborhood had always lived with hardship, but now it lived with fear. During the day, life moved forward out of necessity, vendors shouting prices, children playing in narrow streets, women returning home tired from work. But when night fell, a different rhythm took over. Police vehicles cruised slowly, stopping without reason, their presence heavy and deliberate. Everyone knew what that meant. Silence, submission, payment. People began coming to me not only for confession, but for refuge. They spoke in low voices, glancing toward the doors as if the walls themselves might betray them. A father told me his son had vanished for 2 days after refusing to hand over money. A mother said officers had threatened to arrest her teenage boy unless she cooperated. The stories were disturbingly similar, repeated with different faces and the same despair. Each time I listened, something tightened inside me. It was no longer distant injustice. It was systematic, calculated cruelty. From the pulpit, my words changed. At first, I spoke cautiously about dignity, about the misuse of power, about the moral responsibility of those who carry authority. Then, slowly, I became more direct. I spoke of oppression as sin, of fear as a weapon, of silence as complicity. I did not name names, but everyone understood who I was talking about. I could see it in their eyes, some filled with hope, others with terror. They knew, as I should have known, that such words carried consequences. What unsettled me most was where my courage came from. At night, as I read the Quran in secret, verses about justice echoed in my mind long after I closed the book. They followed me into the church, into my sermons, into my thoughts. They spoke of standing firm for truth even against oneself, of not allowing hatred to justify wrongdoing, of accountability before God alone. I had never heard justice described with such moral precision. Without realizing it, those words began shaping my actions. The police noticed. Their behavior toward me changed subtly at first. Longer stares, unnecessary patrols near the church, questions disguised as casual conversation. "Father, you've been very active lately," one officer said with a thin smile. "Just doing my duty," I replied, forcing calm into my voice. I told myself I was protected. I was a priest, a public figure. Surely they would not dare cross that line. But arrogance blinds before it destroys. One evening, after the church had emptied, I sat alone in the nave, staring at the altar. The silence felt different, heavier, charged. I thought of the people who had trusted me with their pain. I thought of the words I read in secret and the life I lived in public. For the first time, I felt that neutrality was no longer possible. Speaking cautiously was no longer enough. Truth demanded clarity, not comfort. I did not know that my name was already being discussed elsewhere. I did not know that my sermons were being interpreted not as moral guidance, but as provocation. And I did not know that a single moment, one careless observation, one unseen witness had already sealed my fate. I believed I was confronting injustice with words. I did not yet understand that injustice was preparing to answer with force. I did not realize when the line was crossed. There was no announcement, no warning that the ground beneath me had shifted. The danger did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, through glances held too long, through silences that carried intention, through the sudden awareness that I was no longer invisible. The first sign came on an ordinary evening. I had stayed behind after closing the church, as I often did. The neighborhood outside had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that never feels peaceful, only watchful. I moved carefully, turned off the lights one by one, and stepped into the small room behind the altar. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the drawer and took out the Quran. I did not read for long. I only needed a few verses, enough to steady my heart after another day of listening to pain I could not undo. I did not hear the sound behind me until it was too late. A shadow passed across the doorway. I turned instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met. He was not a parishioner. He was not lost. He was a police officer, still in uniform, his face unreadable. His gaze moved from my face to the book in my hands. He said nothing. He did not need to. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the corridor. I stood frozen, the weight of that moment crushing my chest. I knew with absolute certainty that what he had seen could not be unseen. I closed the drawer, locked it, and sat down heavily, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself I was overreacting, that curiosity was not a crime, that reading was not betrayal. But fear does not listen to reason. From that night on, everything changed. The patrols near the church increased. Police cars parked directly across the street, engines idling for no reason. Officers who once greeted me politely now watched in silence. Their eyes followed me as I walked, measuring, calculating. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. The air itself seemed tense, as if the truth were pressing outward, demanding to be acknowledged. Then came the message. It was not written. It was spoken, quietly, with a smile that did not reach the eyes. "Father," one of them said as he passed me on the steps of the church, "be careful what you read. Some books change people, and not everyone appreciates change." I understood then that this was no longer about sermons or social justice. This was about control, about power threatened. To them, I was no longer simply a priest who spoke too much. I was something worse, a man slipping beyond their categories, neither fully theirs nor clearly aligned with the people they oppressed. That terrified them. I began sleeping poorly. Every sound outside my window jolted me awake. I considered destroying the book, burning it, erasing the evidence. But each time the thought crossed my mind, something stopped me. Not defiance, not courage. Something quieter and stronger. The truth I had touched could not be undone. I was being watched, judged, marked. And though I did not yet know how or when, I sensed with chilling clarity that the secret I had carried in silence was about to drag me into a confrontation I could no longer avoid. The night it happened felt ordinary, and that was what made it terrifying in retrospect. There was no storm, no warning sign in the sky, no voice telling me to stay inside. I finished the evening prayers, locked the front doors of the church, and stood for a moment on the steps, breathing in the cool air. The street was quiet, almost empty, lit only by a few tired lamps and the distant glow of traffic. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself nothing would happen. I was wrong. As I walked toward the small parking area behind the church, two figures emerged from the shadows. They moved with the ease of men who were used to being obeyed. Civilian clothes, but the posture gave them away immediately. One of them raised his hand just long enough for a badge to flash in the dim light. "Father Jose," he said calmly, "you need to come with us." There was no aggression in his voice, no urgency. That calmness was more frightening than shouting. I asked what this was about, trying to keep my tone steady, trying to sound like the man I used to be, the priest who believed titles could still protect him. The younger officer smiled faintly. "You already know," he said. "Let's not make this difficult." They did not wait for my consent. One grabbed my arm, firm but controlled, while the other positioned himself behind me. I tried to protest, but the words died in my throat. Something in their eyes told me that resistance would only make things worse. They guided me toward a dark car parked at the corner, its engine already running. Inside the car, silence pressed down on me like a weight. No questions, no explanations. Just the sound of the road beneath the tires and my own breathing, too loud in my ears. I tried to memorize the route, watching street signs flash past, but panic scrambled my thoughts. We were heading toward the river. I knew that much. Everyone in the city knew what that direction meant. The car stopped on a deserted bridge. The smell of the water below was sharp and foul, rising through the gaps in the concrete. Traffic passed in the distance, indifferent, unaware. They opened the door and pulled me out. The night air felt suddenly cold against my skin. "So," the older officer said, leaning close enough that I could smell cigarettes on his breath, "the holy man likes to read forbidden books." My heart pounded. I tried to speak, to explain, to deny, but my voice betrayed me. The younger one laughed softly. "Relax, Father," he said. "This won't take long." They produced wire from the trunk, rough, cruel-looking, and before I fully understood what was happening, my hands were forced behind my back. Pain shot through my wrists as the wire tightened. I gasped, instinctively pulling away, only to feel the metal bite deeper. That was the moment fear became certainty. This was not an arrest. This was not a warning. As they dragged me toward the edge of the bridge, the dark water moving silently below, I realized that words, titles, and silence had all lost their power. Whatever happened next would strip me down to something far more basic than a priest. A man. Alone. Facing death. They dragged me to the railing without urgency, as if they had done this before and knew there was no need to rush. My feet scraped against the concrete, my balance unsteady, my hands burning behind my back where the wire cut deeper with every movement. The bridge felt impossibly high. Below us, the river flowed dark and heavy, carrying with it the stench of waste and decay. It did not look like water meant to give life. It looked like a place where things were discarded and forgotten. I tried to speak. At first, words came out broken, tangled with fear. I told them I would stop talking, that I would stay quiet, that I would disappear if they wanted. I promised things I did not believe in, clung to bargaining because it was all I had left. They did not respond. The younger one leaned against the railing, watching me the way someone watches an insect struggle. "Do you know what your mistake was?" the older officer asked, almost casually. "You forgot your place." I looked at him, my vision blurring. My place. That word echoed inside me. For years I had believed I knew my place, above others, entitled to judge, protected by a title and a collar. Now that illusion lay shattered at my feet. The wire tightened again as they repositioned me. Pain pulsed through my arms, sharp and relentless. I felt warm blood trickle down my wrists. My heart hammered so violently that it felt like it might break my ribs from the inside. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, competing with the distant hum of traffic. For a moment, everything slowed. I saw flashes of my life, not dramatic memories, but small, painful ones. Faces I had turned away, doors I had closed, people who had come to me broken and left more broken than before. I had spoken about God, about truth, about righteousness, but I had forgotten mercy. Standing there, suspended between the sky and the river, I understood that no sermon had ever brought me as close to honesty as this moment. The older officer grabbed the back of my coat and lifted me just enough that my feet barely touched the ground. Panic surged. Instinct screamed at me to fight, to cling to the railing, to do anything. But the wire made my hands useless. I was helpless in a way I had never been before. "Any last prayers, Father?" the younger one said mockingly. I opened my mouth and stopped. For the first time in my life, the words I had repeated for years refused to come. The prayers I knew by heart felt distant, hollow, like echoes from a world that no longer belonged to me. I searched inside myself for something real, something true, something that was not built on fear or position. In that suspended moment, with death waiting below and silence pressing in from all sides, one name rose from deep within me. Not from habit, not from doctrine, from surrender. "Allah," I whispered. The sound was barely audible, carried away by the night air, but as the word left my lips, something shifted inside me. The terror did not disappear, but it loosened its grip. I felt exposed, stripped of every false identity, reduced to a single truth. I was no longer relying on who I claimed to be, I was relying on who He is. They lifted me higher, and then the world tilted. The world narrowed to a single point of balance, a fragile line between falling and being held. My body swayed as they lifted me, the night air tearing at my face. Below, the river moved like a living shadow, patient and endless. I felt the last of my strength drain away, not from my muscles, but from my will to pretend. There was nothing left to bargain with. No title to invoke, no authority to hide behind. I closed my eyes, not in fear, but in surrender. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to control the outcome. I stopped arguing with God in my mind. I stopped performing faith and began to face it. The truth was simple and terrifying. If I lived, it would not be because I deserved it, and if I died, it would not be because I was wronged alone. I had lived a life measured by judgment, and judgment had finally reached me. My lips moved again, this time with clarity. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah," I whispered. and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." The words came without effort, no fear, no hesitation. They did not sound foreign. They sounded inevitable, like a door I had been standing in front of for years finally opened. As the testimony left my mouth, something inside me broke open. Not violently, but completely. The tight knot in my chest loosened. The noise of the world dulled. Even the river's stench seemed to fade. I did not feel brave. I felt small. And for the first time, that felt right. One of the officers laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Hear that?" he said to the other. "He's switched gods." But the laughter did not last. The air changed. Not dramatically, not with thunder or fire, but with weight. A pressure settled around us, heavy and unmistakable, like the moment before a storm that never arrives. The hum of distant traffic seemed to drop away. The bridge felt suddenly exposed, stripped of its indifference. The younger officer shifted uneasily. "Did you feel that?" he muttered. The older one did not answer. The wind picked up, swirling dust across the concrete. The car behind us sputtered, then fell silent. Its headlights flickered once and went out, plunging the bridge into a deeper darkness. Not the darkness of absence, but of awareness, the kind that makes the heart race without understanding why. I was still suspended, my body trembling, but my mind was calm. I did not ask for punishment to fall upon them. I did not wish them harm. I asked only for truth to prevail, whatever that meant. And in that calm, I understood something I had never grasped before. Divine power does not need spectacle. It does not need cruelty to announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as fear in the hearts of those who believe themselves untouchable. The older officer released his grip slightly, just enough for uncertainty to betray him. He looked around, his face pale, eyes darting as if searching for something he could not see. "Enough," he said, though no one had spoken. "This is wrong." The wire around my wrists loosened, not cut, not snapped, simply slackened as if the tension holding it had vanished. I felt my arms drop, numb and aching, but free. They stepped back. I remained where I was, breathing slowly, grounded in a peace that did not belong to the bridge, the river, or the night. It belonged to surrender. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I had already crossed the point of no return, not into death, but into truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound I had ever known. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, the kind of silence that does not belong to absence, but to presence. I stood there, no longer restrained, my arms hanging uselessly at my sides, pain pulsing through my wrists, yet my heart strangely steady. The officers were no longer looking at me. They were looking around them. The younger one took a step back, nearly stumbling. His face had lost its color, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to shout, but could not find his voice. His eyes darted from the dark river below to the empty road above, then back to me as though trying to decide whether I was real or not. "This isn't right," he whispered. "This isn't how it was supposed to go." The older officer clenched his jaw. He tried to regain control, to straighten his posture, to become the man he had been moments earlier, the man who laughed, who commanded, who believed himself powerful. But something invisible had already stripped that authority from him. His hands were shaking. He noticed them and hid them behind his back, but it was too late. Fear had already claimed him. A sudden gust of wind swept across the bridge, stronger than before, carrying dust and debris that stung the eyes. The metal railing groaned softly, not breaking, but bending just enough to make its presence felt. Far below, the river surged harder against the concrete pillars, its dark surface rippling unnaturally, as if responding to something unseen. The younger officer dropped to one knee. "I swear," he gasped, clutching his chest, "I can't breathe." There was no fire, no lightning, no voice from the sky. And yet, something undeniable was happening. The kind of terror that bypasses the mind and settles directly into the soul. The kind that exposes every lie a person has told himself about power and control. The older officer backed away from the edge, his boots scraping loudly against the concrete. "We have to go," he said, his voice cracking. Now! He looked at me then, not with hatred, not with mockery, but with naked fear. What did you do? He demanded. I shook my head slowly. Nothing, I said. And it was the truth. I asked Allah for mercy. That word, Allah, seemed to break something inside him. His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw a reflection of myself in them. A man confronted with a reality he had spent his life denying. A reality that does not negotiate, does not threaten, does not explain itself. The car behind us remained dead. No matter how many times the older officer turned the key, the engine refused to respond. The headlights stayed dark. His breathing became rapid, uneven. Panic stripped away his last defenses. "Leave him!" the younger one shouted suddenly, scrambling to his feet. "Just leave him!" They did not argue. They ran. Not with discipline, not with dignity, but with desperation. Their footsteps echoed wildly as they fled across the bridge, disappearing into the darkness they had once controlled. I watched them go, my body trembling now, not from fear, but from the delayed shock of survival. I remained alone on the bridge, the night slowly returning to its ordinary sounds. Traffic resumed in the distance. The wind softened. The river calmed. But I knew with absolute certainty that what had occurred was not ordinary. No one had touched them. No weapon had been raised. No punishment had fallen from the sky. And yet they had been defeated. Because when Allah removes fear from the heart of the oppressed, He places it firmly in the hearts of the oppressors. I stood on the bridge long after they disappeared, my legs barely able to support me. The cold finally reached my bones, not from the night air alone, but from the realization of how close I had come to death. My wrists throbbed where the wire had bitten into my skin, each pulse a reminder that what had happened was real, not a dream or a trick of fear. I wrapped my arms around myself and breathed slowly, forcing my body to obey my will again. The car remained abandoned behind me, silent and lifeless. Its dark shape felt like a relic of something defeated. I did not approach it. I did not need to. Whatever power had stripped it of movement had already delivered its message. I turned away from the railing and began to walk, each step careful, unsteady, but deliberate. With every pace, the bridge felt less like a place of execution and more like a threshold I had crossed. By the time I reached the far end, the city had begun to stir. A bus passed, its headlights briefly illuminating my torn coat and bloodied hands. The driver slowed, hesitated, then drove on. I did not blame him. I must have looked like a ghost, someone pulled from a place no one wanted to imagine. I found a side street and kept walking until my lungs burned and my body demanded rest. I reached a small park just as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. I collapsed onto a bench, exhaustion overtaking me. There, in the quiet, the weight of the night finally settled. I had escaped, but escape was only the beginning. What they had done could not remain hidden. What they had tried to silence would not stay buried. Within days, the story began to surface. The abandoned police vehicle was found on the bridge. Reports were filed. Questions were asked. At first, there were denials, claims of mechanical failure, of coincidence, of misunderstanding. But fear has a way of loosening tongues. One officer spoke, then another. Complaints from families that had long been ignored resurfaced, now backed by courage they had not possessed before. The pattern became impossible to deny. Investigations followed. The men who had dragged me toward the river were suspended, then arrested, not for what they intended to do to me alone, but for years of extortion, threats, and abuse that finally came into the light. I did not testify publicly at first. I did not need to. The truth had gathered momentum of its own. As for me, I disappeared. I did not return to the church. I did not wear the cassock again. I sought refuge in anonymity, staying with people who asked no questions and demanded no explanations. During that time, I reflected on what survival truly meant. I understood that I had been spared not to return to who I was, but to abandon that identity entirely. One night, alone in a small room, I washed the blood from my wrists and looked at my reflection. For the first time, I did not see a priest. I did not see a victim. I saw a man who had been given clarity at the edge of death. I whispered the words of faith again, not in desperation this time, but in certainty. I knew then that my escape was not merely physical. I had been released from fear, from pride, from the need to belong to structures that demanded silence in the face of injustice. The bridge had been an ending, but what awaited me now was something far more difficult than survival. It was transformation. I returned to the city weeks later, not as the man people remembered, but as someone almost invisible. I no longer wore the clothes that once announced who I was. There was no collar, no symbols, no authority stitched into fabric. I moved through streets where people passed me without recognition, and for the first time in my life, that anonymity felt like mercy. I had taken a new name, not for drama and not to erase my past, but to step forward without the weight of it. I chose the name Abdullah, not because it sounded powerful, but because it reminded me of my place. A servant, nothing more, nothing less. I did not go to a mosque immediately. I did not stand before anyone and declare my transformation. What I had entered was too sacred to rush, too deep to perform. My faith was no longer something I needed to prove. It was something I needed to live. I began with the simplest acts, learning how to pray properly, understanding the meaning behind the words I had once whispered in desperation. Each movement felt unfamiliar at first, but not foreign. It felt like remembering something I had always known but forgotten. I spent long hours alone, studying quietly, asking questions without pride. The Quran I once read in secret now rested openly beside me. I no longer feared being seen with it. Fear had lost its authority over me on that bridge. In its place was a steady awareness that truth does not need protection. It protects itself. People eventually noticed the change, though they did not know its origin. Some recognized my face but could not place it. Others sensed something different in the way I spoke, the way I listened. I no longer argued. I no longer judged. I did not correct people or challenge their beliefs. I had learned that guidance cannot be forced, and truth does not shout. When questions came, I answered simply, yes, I was once someone else. Yes, I was lost. No, I am not special. I did not speak publicly about what happened on the bridge. Not because I was afraid, but because the lesson was not in the spectacle. It was in the outcome. The officers who once terrorized the neighborhood were gone. The families they had oppressed were slowly reclaiming their lives. Justice, imperfect as it was, had moved forward. And I had moved with it, quietly. What surprised me most was the peace. Not the absence of hardship, but the absence of conflict inside myself. I was no longer divided between light and shadow. There was no hidden drawer, no double life. What I believed, I lived. What I lived, I carried with humility. Sometimes, late at night, I thought of the man I used to be, the certainty, the harshness, the pride disguised as faith. I did not hate him. I understood him. He was searching in the wrong direction, clinging to control instead of truth. The bridge had not destroyed me. It had stripped me. And in that stripping, I had found what I had been reading about all along. Not in secret, not in fear, but in surrender. I had found Islam. And for the first time, I was no longer pretending to be close to God. I was walking toward him. I never returned to the pulpit, and I never stood on a stage to tell my story. That chapter of my life had closes, not with noise or applause, but with understanding. I learned that not every truth needs a microphone, and not every transformation needs witnesses. Some changes are meant to ripple quietly, altering lives without announcing themselves. I began serving people in ways that did not require titles. I helped where help was needed, distributing food, accompanying the fearful to offices they were afraid to enter alone, listening to stories no one else had the patience to hear. I did not ask about faith, and I did not demand agreement. I had learned, painfully and clearly, that guidance cannot be imposed, it must be invited. People asked who I was. I told them my name, nothing more. Some recognized me eventually, A few remembered the priest who once spoke harshly from the altar. They waited for explanations, apologies, declarations. I gave them none. Instead, I showed them consistency, day after day, word after word, action after action. Over time, their curiosity softened into trust. One evening, a young man asked me quietly, "Why do you help everyone, even those who can't give you anything back?" I paused before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. "Because I once believed I was better than others," I said, "and I was wrong." That was enough. The city moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. Names faded from memory. But something had changed beneath the surface. Fear no longer ruled the neighborhood the way it once had. People stood a little straighter. They spoke a little louder. They knew now that power could be challenged, that silence was not destiny. As for me, I carried one lesson above all others. Faith is not proven by what we claim. It is revealed by what we do when no one is watching. I did not speak of divine punishment or miracles. I spoke of accountability, of mercy, of humility. I told people that God does not belong to institutions or uniforms, and that injustice, no matter how protected it seems, always exposes itself in the end. Sometimes, late at night, I returned in my thoughts to the bridge. Not with fear, but with clarity. I remembered the moment when everything false fell away, when fear loosened its grip, when surrender became strength. I understood then what I had misunderstood for most of my life. That God does not wait for perfection. He waits for honesty. He does not ask us to rise above others, but to stand with them. And He does not save us because we are worthy, but because He is merciful. My story did not end with survival. It began there. Not as a priest, not as a victim, but as a servant who finally understood that truth is not something we possess. It is something we submit to. And that submission, once sincere, changes everything.